The prairie wind whispered secrets across Silver Creek Ranch, rustling the tall grass that surrounded Grace Harmon's weathered cabin. At 65, Grace had grown accustomed to the language of silence, the creak of floorboards beneath her feet, the soft whine of her old dog Ranger when he dreamed, the emptiness that had settled into her bones since Robert passed 8 years ago. Some wounds, Grace had learned, never truly healed. They just became part of you, like the calluses on her hands from working the land alone. She winced as she lowered herself onto the porch steps, massaging her right knee. The pain had been worsening for days, a constant throb that kept her awake at night, the skin taut and feverish to the touch. Another reminder that time marched forward, even when your heart remained tethered to the past. "Just old age coming for me, Ranger," she murmured to the border collie sprawled at her feet. His graying muzzle lifted at her voice, brown eyes watching her with unwavering devotion as he thumped his tail against the wooden boards. Inside the cabin, dried herbs hung from the rafters. Sage, lavender, and rosemary she'd gathered through summer's heat. The scents mingled with wood smoke from the small fire she kept burning even in milder weather. The flames were company of a sort, dancing shadows across the quilt Robert's mother had made for their wedding. That night, as Grace prepared for bed, the pain in her knee reached a crescendo. She bit back a cry as she sat heavily on the edge of her mattress, the old iron frame creaking beneath her weight. Ranger whimpered, nosing at her hand. "It's all right, boy," she assured him, though her voice trembled. "Just need to rest it." But sleep remained elusive, the throbbing in her knee like a second heartbeat. Past midnight, Grace awoke with a gasp to a strange sensation, warmth spreading down her leg. In the pale moonlight filtering through the curtains, she pulled back the blanket. The swelling had burst, but instead of blood or infection, something small and solid pressed outward from the broken skin. With trembling fingers, Grace reached for the oil lamp, striking a match with unsteady hands. In the golden light, she stared in disbelief at the object emerging from her flesh. A small bundle wrapped in soft leather, no larger than her thumb. Intricate blue and black beadwork covered its surface in patterns she'd never seen before. As she gently extracted it, the pain vanished completely. The swollen flesh receded, leaving her skin smooth and unmarked, as though the wound had never existed. "Lord have mercy," Grace whispered, turning the bundle in her palm. It felt warm, alive somehow, pulsing with gentle energy. Ranger sat up alert, ears forward, eyes fixed on the bundle. In the stillness of the midnight hour, Grace felt something stir within her. Not fear, but something deeper. A certainty that the world had just shifted beneath her feet. "What are you?" she wondered silently. "And why have you come to me?" Pine Grove had changed little in the years since Grace had last ventured into town. The general store still displayed the same faded goods in its windows. The saloon still leaked piano music and laughter onto the dusty street. And the white-steepled church still stood sentinel at the end of Main Street, its bell tower reaching toward heaven. Grace felt eyes follow her as she tied Willow, her aging mare, to the hitching post. Whispers trailed in her wake. The widow Harmon, the recluse, poor thing living all alone up in those hills. Ranger padded faithfully beside her, occasionally brushing against her leg as if to remind her she wasn't truly alone. The medicine bundle rested in her pocket, its weight slight yet somehow significant. She'd wrapped it carefully in a clean handkerchief, unable to explain even to herself why she felt so protective of it. Pastor Richardson had been the town's spiritual guide for over 30 years. His hair had gone from salt and pepper to pure white, but his eyes remained kind behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He looked up from his Bible as Grace entered his study, surprise crossing his features before he smiled warmly. "Grace Harmon, it's been too long." "Hello, Pastor." Her voice sounded rough from disuse. How long had it been since she'd spoken to anyone but Ranger? Richardson gestured to a chair. "What brings you to town? Everything all right at the ranch?" Wordlessly, Grace removed the bundle from her pocket and placed it on his desk. The pastor leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "I found this," Grace said, then hesitated. How to explain where she'd found it? Or maybe it found me. Richardson's expression changed as he examined the beadwork. "This is Apache craftsmanship," he said quietly. "A medicine bundle, sacred to their healers." He looked up, eyes searching her face. "Where did you get this, Grace?" Before she could answer, commotion erupted outside. Raised voices, a woman pleading. Grace followed Richardson to the church steps. A small wagon had pulled up, dust still settling around the tired horse that had drawn it. A woman in a simple dress stood beside it, her dark hair streaked with gray, her face lined with exhaustion and fear. Beside her, a young boy of perhaps 10 leaned heavily against her, his slight frame racked with coughing. "Please," the woman called out, her English accented but clear. "I seek the pastor. My son needs help." Richardson hurried forward, Grace following behind. The woman's dark eyes widened at the sight of the pastor's collar. "I am Hannah," she said. "This is my son, Noah. He has fever that will not break." The boy's face was flushed, his breathing labored. As Richardson reached to help, Noah stumbled, lurching forward. Grace moved instinctively, catching him before he could fall. The boy's hand clutched her knee for support, exactly where the bundle had emerged. The effect was immediate. His coughing subsided, his breathing eased. Noah looked up at Grace, confusion and relief mingling in his fever-bright eyes. "The medicine bundle," Hannah whispered, her gaze fixed on Grace's pocket, where the edge of the handkerchief was visible. "You have it?" Grace felt a chill run down her spine. "How do you know about this?" "It belonged to my husband, David Blackfeather, a healer." Hannah's voice tightened. "Soldiers killed him 2 winters ago. They took his medicine bundle, called it witchcraft." The boy stared at Grace with uncanny intensity. "Father said it would find the right person," he murmured in a voice too old for his ears. Before Grace could respond, the sound of spurs jingling against wooden boards drew her attention. Deputy Wallace approached, thumbs hooked in his belt, his weathered face set in stern lines. The silver star on his chest caught the sunlight. A long scar ran from his temple to his jaw, pulling his mouth into a permanent half-sneer. Behind him trailed a younger man, Thomas Miller, barely into his 20s with an earnest face and watchful eyes. The newest deputy, Grace recalled from Mrs. Peterson's occasional letters. A local boy, son of the blacksmith, who'd always had a gentle way with horses. "What's all this commotion?" Wallace demanded, eyes narrowing at the sight of Hannah and Noah. Thomas hung back, his gaze moving from the sick boy to Grace with undisguised concern. "Just offering Christian charity, deputy," Richardson replied evenly. "This boy is ill." Wallace's gaze shifted to Grace, recognition dawning. "Widow Harmon, didn't expect to see you in town." His attention dropped to her pocket, then back to her face. "Heard talk about some Indian trinket. Best be careful with such things." Grace straightened, meeting his gaze. "The boy needs rest and care. That's all that matters right now." Something flickered in Wallace's eyes. Not just disdain, but something deeper. Pain, perhaps. Or guilt. He touched the scar on his face unconsciously. "Railroad men are coming next week," he said, voice low. "They don't take kindly to complications." With a final warning look, he turned and walked away, spurs marking his departure. Thomas lingered, stepping closer. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "if you need any help getting them settled, just send word." He glanced over his shoulder to ensure Wallace was out of earshot. "My mother always spoke highly of you." Grace nodded, surprised by the unexpected offer. "Thank you, Thomas." She turned to Hannah, decision made. "You'll come with me, both of you. My ranch is quiet. Safe." Hannah's eyes shone with unshed tears. "Why would you help us?" Grace touched her knee, remembering the bundle that had inexplicably emerged from her flesh. "I'm not entirely sure," she admitted, "but I think we were meant to find each other." Life at Silver Creek Ranch transformed with startling swiftness. The cabin that had known only Grace's solitary footsteps now echoed with Noah's careful movements as he regained strength. The kitchen, once silent save for the scrape of a single plate, now filled with quiet conversation as Hannah shared stories of her people while helping prepare meals. Grace watched Hannah steep herbs in hot water. Yarrow, willow bark, and plants Grace couldn't name. The fragrant steam seemed to ease Noah's breathing. "My husband taught me," Hannah explained, catching Grace's curious gaze. "He was known among all tribes for his healing knowledge. Even some white settlers came to him." "Robert, my husband. He had a way with animals," Grace offered, surprising herself. How long had it been since she'd spoken his name aloud? Could calm the wildest horse just by standing near it. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, the silence comfortable now rather than hollow. Noah sometimes hummed songs in his native tongue, melodies that made Grace's chest ache with their beauty. Ranger had appointed himself the boy's guardian, trailing him everywhere, sleeping at the foot of his makeshift bed. One night, as Noah slept and the fire burned low, Hannah spoke of what happened to her husband. "The soldiers came at dawn," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "David had just healed one of their own, a young officer with fever. But their commander called it savage magic. They shot him as he stood in our doorway." Her fingers worked the edge of her shawl. "Before he died, he gave the medicine bundle to me. Said it contained not just healing, but wisdom, a bridge between peoples. And somehow it ended up inside me," Grace murmured, still struggling to comprehend. "The bundle chooses," Hannah said simply. "It found you because you were meant to have it." Grace shook her head. "I'm no one special, just a stubborn old woman trying to keep her ranch from falling apart." Hannah's smile was gentle but knowing. "Sometimes that is exactly who the Creator chooses." The next morning, Mrs. Peterson from town arrived in her husband's wagon, bearing bread and news. A stout woman with apple cheeks and practical hands, she'd been the school teacher for 30 years before arthritis forced her retirement. She was one of the few who had maintained correspondence with Grace after Robert's death. "Thought you might need provisions," she said, eyes widening at the sight of Hannah and Noah. To her credit, she recovered quickly, smiling at the boy who shyly returned her greeting. Over coffee at the kitchen table, she leaned forward. "You should know, Grace. People are talking about your guests." She glanced toward Hannah, who was hanging laundry outside. "And about Deputy Wallace." "What about him?" Grace asked. "He was in the cavalry years back, fought against the Apache." Mrs. Peterson lowered her voice. "They say his wife and daughter were saved by an Indian healer when influenza swept through the fort. But later, Wallace participated in a raid that killed many of the same tribe." Grace thought of the scar on Wallace's face, the pain in his eyes. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because he's working with the railroad men now. They're surveying land for the new line." Mrs. Peterson's eyes were troubled. "Your land is in their path, Grace." She squeezed Grace's hand. "But you're not without friends. Mr. Jenkins at the lumber mill was asking after you. Said he'd be happy to help with any repairs you might need." She smiled. "And Thomas Miller, that young deputy, he stood up at the town meeting when folks started gossiping. Said it wasn't Christian to judge without knowing the full story." After Mrs. Peterson left, Grace sat alone on the porch, watching Hannah teach Noah how to mend a shirt. The boy's hands moved carefully, his face intent with concentration. In just days, color had returned to his cheeks. His laughter, rare but brightening, reminded Grace of birdsong after a long winter. That evening, Grace visited Robert's grave beneath the old oak that shadowed the western edge of the property. She'd carved the marker herself, hands bleeding from the effort. "You'd like them, I think," she told the silent stone. "Hannah has your quiet strength, and Noah," she smiled. "He reminds me of what our son might have been." The wind rustled through the leaves overhead, almost like a response. Grace brushed her fingers over the carved letters of Robert's name. "I've been alone so long," she whispered. "I thought that was all there was left for me. But now," she paused, collecting words for feelings long dormant. "Now I feel like maybe I was waiting all this time, not just existing, but waiting for something I didn't know was coming." Ranger's sudden bark broke the moment. Grace turned to see the dog standing alert, hackles raised as he stared into the gathering dusk. Someone was watching the ranch. Sunday morning dawned clear and cool. Grace stood before her small mirror, pinning her silver hair into a neat bun. She hadn't attended church since Robert's funeral, but today felt important, a statement of sorts. Hannah wore the blue shawl Grace had given her, a wedding gift from Robert's mother that had lain folded in a trunk for years. Noah had been dressed in a small vest that Grace had tearfully retrieved from a cedar chest, sewn for the child she'd lost before he could wear it. "Are you certain?" Hannah asked, concern in her eyes as they prepared to leave. "Your people may not welcome us." "Then they'll have to answer to the Lord about it," Grace replied, her jaw set with determination. "His house is open to all." The church bell was ringing as they arrived, calling the faithful to worship. Heads turned as Grace helped Hannah and Noah from the wagon. Whispers rippled through the gathering crowd. Richardson greeted them at the door, genuine warmth in his smile. "Welcome," he said, shaking Hannah's hand without hesitation. "Please, come in." They sat in a pew near the back, the place Robert had always preferred. Mrs. Peterson, to Grace's surprise and gratitude, crossed the aisle to join them, giving Noah's hand a gentle pat. Mr. Jenkins, a tall man with work-roughened hands and kind eyes, nodded respectfully from across the aisle. The lumber mill owner had been Robert's friend once. The organ wheezed to life and the congregation rose to sing Amazing Grace. Noah listened intently to the first verse, then began to hum along, weaving the familiar hymn with words in his own language. By the third verse, he was singing softly, his clear voice blending English and Apache in a harmony that brought tears to Grace's eyes. Some turned to stare in disapproval, but others, like old Mrs. Thompson in the front row, dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Richardson's sermon that day was on the Good Samaritan. "The question is not, 'Who is my neighbor?'" he said, his voice carrying clearly through the church. "But rather, 'To whom can I be a neighbor?'" Grace felt Hannah straighten beside her, dignity radiating from her slender frame despite the stares. Noah leaned against his mother's arm, small fingers tracing the beadwork on her sleeve. As the service ended, several women approached Hannah with hesitant kindness. Old Mr. Jenkins gave Noah a peppermint stick, earning a shy thank you in careful English. Thomas Miller stood by the door, a silent sentinel, offering a respectful nod as they passed. But not everyone was moved. Wallace stood near the church steps, watching their interaction with hooded eyes. As Grace helped Hannah and Noah into the wagon, the deputy approached, his hand resting casually on his holstered pistol. "A word, Harmon," he said, pulling her aside. His voice dropped low. "You're stirring trouble. Railroad men don't like uncertainty." Grace met his gaze without flinching. Noah was sick. Hannah needed shelter. Nothing uncertain about Christian charity. Wallace's eyes narrowed. "Some folks say you've forgotten where your loyalties should lie." "My loyalties lie with what's right," Grace replied evenly. The deputy's hand brushed his holster. "Town's changing, progress is coming, whether folks like you want it or not." His eyes flickered to Hannah and Noah, then back to Grace. For just a moment, something like conflict crossed his scarred face before hardening once more. "Think carefully, Harmon." Grace turned away, climbing onto the wagon seat. Noah reached for her sleeve, his small fingers a gesture of trust that made her throat tighten. Wallace watched them leave, his expression unreadable. The next day brought unwelcome visitors to Silver Creek. Ranger's warning bark alerted Grace to approaching riders. She stepped onto the porch, Hannah and Noah behind her, as 5 men rode into the yard. Wallace led them, flanked by 2 strangers in fine suits and polished boots that had never known real ranch work. Thomas Miller rode slightly apart from the others, his young face troubled. "Afternoon, Widow Harmon," the taller stranger said, tipping his hat. "Name's Thatcher. My associate here is Mr. Lowell. We represent the Western Pacific Railroad." Grace crossed her arms. "What brings railroad men to my door?" "Progress, ma'am." Thatcher's smile never reached his eyes. "Our engineers have surveyed this valley. The most efficient route runs directly through your property." Grace's stomach dropped. "And if I say no?" "We prefer to purchase land at fair market value," Thatcher replied. "But the government grants us certain authorities to claim what's needed for national progress. Wallace's gaze had fixed on Hannah and Noah. "You've let things go too far, Harmon," he said. "First the medicine bundle, now harboring Indians." Grace's hands clenched. "This land was my husband's dream. I buried him here. You'll have to drag me off it." The railroad men exchanged glances. Thatcher's tone hardened. "We'll give you 1 week to reconsider. After that, the law will favor us." They mounted up, Wallace lingering just long enough to spit in the dust. "Think on it," he said. "Best for everyone if you don't fight this." As they rode away, Thomas fell behind the others. He turned briefly in the saddle, his expression torn. Grace understood. He was caught between duty and conscience. When they'd gone, Noah pressed close to Grace's side, trembling. Hannah's face was pale but resolute. "They will not stop," she said quietly. "They never do." Grace placed a protective hand on Noah's shoulder. "Then we won't stop either." That night, the medicine bundle seemed to pulse with warmth as Grace held it. Hannah watched her with knowing eyes. "It's trying to tell you something," she said. "The bundle holds memories, visions." Grace closed her eyes, feeling the strange energy emanating from the beaded leather. Images flickered through her mind. A mountain peak she recognized from the western edge of her property, a hidden spring Robert had once shown her, Hannah's husband with his hands raised in prayer. "I don't understand," Grace whispered. "You will," Hannah assured her, "when the time comes." 3 days later, Grace awoke to the smell of smoke. The storage barn was ablaze, flames licking hungrily at the dry timber. Ranger barked frantically as they formed a bucket line, but it was too late. By dawn, only charred ruins remained. "This was deliberate," Grace said, surveying the destruction. A kerosene can lay discarded nearby, not hers. That afternoon, Noah's fever returned with frightening intensity. He shivered beneath blankets, his small face flushed. Hannah worked tirelessly, applying cool cloths and herbal remedies, but worry lined her face. "The medicine bundle," she said finally. "It might be our only hope." Grace retrieved it from its hiding place beneath a floorboard. As Hannah placed it on Noah's chest, the boy's eyes flew open. He spoke rapidly in Apache. Words Grace couldn't understand, but that made Hannah gasp. "What did he say?" Grace asked. "He sees soldiers," Hannah whispered, "coming at dawn." The prediction proved true. First light had barely touched the hills when hoofbeats thundered up the trail. Wallace led a group of men, including Thatcher and several deputies from neighboring counties. Thomas Miller rode at the rear, his face a mask of indecision. This time, they carried rifles and official papers. "Grace Harmon," Wallace called, "you're under arrest for harboring hostile Indians and obstructing lawful development." Grace stepped onto the porch, shotgun in hand. Ranger growled low beside her. "You know this is wrong, Wallace," she said, her voice carrying across the yard. Wallace's expression flickered. "Put down the weapon, Grace. Don't make this harder." For a moment, she considered resistance. But Noah stood in the doorway behind her, Hannah's protective arm around his shoulders. A shootout would only endanger them. Slowly, Grace set the shotgun down. "Don't hurt them," she said as the men approached. "I'll come peacefully." They bound her wrists with rope, hauling her roughly toward a waiting horse. Ranger lunged forward, teeth bared. A deputy's boot caught him in the ribs, sending him sprawling with a yelp of pain. "Ranger!" Grace cried, twisting in her captor's grip. Thomas moved quickly, placing himself between the injured dog and the deputy. "That's enough," he said, with unexpected authority. "The dog's no threat now." "Grace!" Noah's voice called after her as she was led away. "We won't forget." The last thing she saw was Hannah, holding the weeping boy, her face a mask of determination as she whispered something in his ear. The cell was small and stifling, bare save for a narrow cot and a tin bucket in the corner. Through the barred window, Grace could see the church steeple rising against the blue sky. She sat with her back against the wall, wrists raw from the ropes, mind churning with worry for Hannah, Noah, and Ranger. Mrs. Peterson appeared at midday, passing a basket through to the deputy on duty. "Bread and cheese," she told Grace through the bars, "and clean bandages for your wrists." Hannah and Noah? Grace asked urgently. Vanished into the hills, Mrs. Peterson whispered. Some say they're hiding in the caves near Eagle Peak. Relief flooded through Grace. At least they were free. As evening approached, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Wallace appeared, his face drawn. He dismissed the deputy on duty with a curt nod. You're making a mistake, Harmon, he said, leaning against the bars. Fighting the railroad is like trying to stop a flood with your bare hands. Maybe so, Grace replied. But sometimes doing what's right matters more than winning. Wallace was silent for a long moment. You don't understand what's at stake. Then tell me. His fingers touched the scar on his face. You think I don't know what that medicine bundle is? What it means? His voice was low, tightly controlled. 8 years ago, I lay dying in an Apache camp. Arrow wound, fever setting in. Blackfeather, Hannah's husband. He used that bundle. Saved my life. Grace stared at him. And yet you helped kill him. I was under orders. The words burst from him, raw and defensive. I tried to warn them, but he fell silent, the weight of old guilt evident in his hunched shoulders. It's not too late to make a different choice, Grace said softly. Wallace straightened, mask falling back into place. The hearing's tomorrow. Richardson will preside. Without another word, he turned and walked away, boot heels echoing on the wooden floor. That night, as darkness fell and the jailhouse grew quiet, a scratching sound woke Grace from fitful sleep. She approached the window, heart leaping at the familiar whine. Ranger? She whispered. The border collie stood in the alley below, limping but alive. In his mouth glinted something familiar, the medicine bundle. Somehow Hannah had sent it to her. Grace reached through the bars. Ranger jumped up, depositing the bundle in her outstretched hand. The moment her fingers closed around it, warmth spread up her arm. Visions flooded her mind, clearer now. Hannah and Noah huddled in a cave, the boy coughing weakly, a spring bubbling from rock. Wallace standing alone on a ridge, head bowed. And something else, the face of a man she'd never seen, with gentle eyes and strong features. David Blackfeather. His lips moved in words she somehow understood. Truth has power. Speak it fearlessly. Grace clutched the bundle to her chest. I will, she whispered to the empty cell. I promise. The trial, if it could be called that, was set for Sunday, in the church itself. The railroad company had insisted on speed, and Richardson had offered the only space in town large enough to hold everyone who wished to attend. Grace stood before the makeshift court, back straight despite her exhaustion. Wallace sat beside Thatcher, avoiding her eyes. Thomas Miller stood near the door, his posture alert, watchful. The townsfolk filled the pews, divided in their allegiances, some supportive, others hostile. Mr. Jenkins sat prominently in the front row, his weathered face set in stubborn lines of support. Richardson read the charges with obvious reluctance. Unlawful harboring of Indians, obstruction of federal progress, suspected involvement in pagan practices. When asked to speak, Grace stepped forward, the medicine bundle concealed in her pocket. Its warmth gave her strength. I've lived on Silver Creek Ranch for 40 years, she began, her voice stronger than she'd expected. I've buried a husband and an unborn child there. I've weathered drought and blizzard, outlasted loneliness that would break most souls. She looked directly at Wallace. When Hannah and Noah came, they needed help. The boy was dying. Would any of you have turned them away? Would Christ? A murmur ran through the congregation. Grace continued, drawing the bundle from her pocket. This medicine bundle was found inside my own flesh, she said, holding it high. The beadwork caught the light streaming through the stained glass windows. I did not ask for it, but it came to me. It healed me. It led Hannah and Noah to me when they needed shelter. She turned slowly, meeting the eyes of her neighbors one by one. We all carry wounds. Mine was losing Robert and our child. But the deepest wound is when we let fear close our hearts to those different from us. Grace paused, the church silent save for the creaking of wooden pews. This bundle doesn't belong to me. It belonged to a healer named David Blackfeather, a man who saved lives, even the lives of soldiers who later killed him. She looked at Wallace, whose face had gone pale. "Isn't that right, Deputy?" The church erupted in whispers. Wallace stood abruptly, hand trembling as he touched the scar on his face. "I was there," he admitted, voice hoarse. 8 years ago, we raided their camp, called it a peacekeeping operation. His laugh was bitter. Blackfeather had saved my life a month earlier when an arrow took me here. He traced the scar. Fever would have killed me, but he used that bundle, and I repaid him by standing by while my commanding officer shot him. Gasps echoed through the church. Thatcher rose in outrage. "This is absurd. The railroad has rights." "And what of Grace's rights?" Mrs. Peterson interrupted, standing firmly. "What of the boy's life? Don't speak to us of progress when it tramples people underfoot." "My father cleared that land with his bare hands," Mr. Jenkins added, rising to his feet. "Sold part to Robert Harmon fair and square. No paper-pushing railroad man has the right to take what isn't freely given." Others joined in, voices rising in support of Grace. Richardson struck his gavel for order. The church quieted, tension vibrating in the air. "Before I rule," Richardson said, "there's something else you should see." The doors at the back of the church swung open. Hannah entered slowly, supporting Noah between herself and, to Grace's relief, Thomas Miller, who had evidently gone to find them in the caves. "The boy's been sick without the medicine," Thomas explained, helping Noah forward. "Found them where Mrs. Harmon said they'd be. Like she knew somehow." Noah looked directly at Wallace, his young face solemn. "My father forgave you," he said in clear English, "before you killed him. He said the burden you would carry would be punishment enough." Wallace sank back into his seat, head bowed. Have you ever witnessed someone transform from enemy to ally? Grace's story reminds us it's never too late to choose what's right. Subscribe to our channel for more healing stories that touch the soul. Grace crossed the church quickly, gathering Noah in her arms. The boy clutched her dress, burying his face against her shoulder. Hannah's eyes shone with tears of relief. "The medicine bundle," Grace said, pressing it into Hannah's hands. "It belongs with your son." Hannah closed Grace's fingers back around it. "It chose you," she said simply. "My husband would be honored." Richardson cleared his throat. "I believe I've heard enough. The charges against Grace Harmon are dismissed." Thatcher slammed his fist on the table. "This isn't over. The railroad will." "Choose another route," Wallace interrupted, standing to face the railroad man. "Or I'll testify about how you offered me bribes to falsify survey reports, how you ordered that barn burned." Thatcher's face contorted with rage, but looking around at the united townsfolk, he recognized defeat. With a curt nod to Lowell, he stormed from the church. Outside, sunlight bathed the gathering in golden warmth. Ranger bounded to Grace's side, tail wagging despite his healing ribs. Noah knelt to embrace the dog, laughing as Ranger licked his face. Wallace approached hesitantly. "I can't undo what I did," he said, voice rough with emotion, "but I aim to make amends, if you'll let me." Grace studied the man who had been her enemy, seeing now the weight of regret he carried. "Redemption takes time," she said, "but it always begins with a choice." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Thank you." As they prepared to return to Silver Creek, Mrs. E.C. Peterson and several other women approached with baskets of food and offers of help rebuilding the burned storage barn. Mr. Jenkins promised lumber from his mill. "No charge," he insisted. "Robert would have done the same for me." Thomas Miller offered to ride out weekends to help with repairs. The community that had long kept Grace at a distance now rallied around her, bridging the divide that grief and solitude had created. 1 year later, Silver Creek Ranch had transformed. The rebuilt barn stood stronger than before. A small schoolhouse had been raised on the eastern edge of the property, where Hannah taught children from both the town and neighboring Apache families the traditional ways of healing. Grace's garden flourished, vegetables and herbs growing in neat rows. Noah, healthy and strong, raced Ranger across the meadows and helped Grace with the horses. Wallace, retired from his deputy position, occasionally visited, bringing supplies and news from town. His tentative friendship with Hannah had begun to heal old wounds on both sides. Each week, a dozen children from town made the journey to Silver Creek for Hannah's lessons. Mrs. Peterson often accompanied them, her knowledge of teaching complementing Hannah's traditional wisdom. Even old Mr. Jenkins attended occasionally, eager to learn about plants that might ease his arthritis. Thomas Miller had married the baker's daughter, and they often brought fresh bread on Sundays. "This place feels more like the heart of our community than the town does," his young wife once remarked, watching the children play. On the anniversary of Robert's death, Grace stood before his grave, medicine bundle in hand. She no longer needed to speak aloud for him to hear her thoughts. "You'd be proud of what's grown here, my love. Not just plants and buildings, but understanding, healing. I found family again, not to replace what we lost, but to honor it by continuing to love. Remember how you used to say land holds memories? I think you were right. This soil remembers your hands, your dreams. And now it's learning new stories to tell." The bundle warmed in her palm, almost like a response. Grace smiled, feeling Robert's presence in the rustling leaves, the gentle breeze, the distant laughter of Noah playing with the town children who had come for Hannah's lessons. She wasn't alone anymore, and the wound in her heart, while still present, had finally begun to heal, making room for new joy she'd never expected to find. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting the valley in amber light, Grace walked back toward the cabin, where Hannah was preparing dinner. Ranger trotted at her heels, graying now but still faithful. Young voices called greetings. Children who once would have feared her remote ranch now considered it a second home. Inside, the cabin glowed with lantern light and life. On the mantel stood a photograph of Robert beside a small drawing Noah had made of their unlikely family. Grace, Hannah, himself, and Ranger, standing before the cabin beneath a sky full of stars. Sometimes the deepest wounds lead us to the most unexpected healing. And sometimes a new family forms from the broken pieces of the old, not as a replacement, but as a continuation of love's endless story. Sometimes our deepest wounds lead to our most unexpected healing paths. As Grace discovered, love can bloom even in the most barren soil of our lives. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Share your experience in the comments, and remember, it's never too late to begin a new chapter of your life.